Before the war, Afghanistan had a government led by a president. In 1978, a big change happened. Some army officers took control of the country. They started a new government. This government followed communist ideas. They wanted to change Afghanistan very fast. They made new rules about land and about people's lives. These new rules were very different from the old ways. Many people in Afghanistan did not like these changes. They were very religious and did not like the communist ideas. They wanted to keep their old traditions and their faith. The new government was not popular with many Afghan people. This new government in Afghanistan was friends with a very big country next door. This country was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was also a communist country. It was very powerful. The new Afghan government asked the Soviet Union for help. Because many Afghan people were unhappy, they started to fight against their new government. These small fights grew bigger and bigger. The Afghan government was losing control. It was afraid it would fall. The Soviet Union watched this situation very closely. It did not want the communist government in Afghanistan to fail. It was worried about what would happen on its border. The Soviet Union decided it had to do something big. It was afraid that if the communist government in Afghanistan fell, it would be bad for them. They thought a new government might be friends with their enemies, like the United States. So on a cold night in December 1979, the Soviet Union sent its army into Afghanistan. Many soldiers and tanks crossed the border. Their plan was to help the weak Afghan government. They wanted to stop the people who were fighting against it. They put a new leader in charge, who they trusted more. This was the start of a very long and sad war for Afghanistan. The Soviet army thought it would be a quick job. They believed they could easily defeat the fighters. They took control of the big cities and the main roads. The new Afghan government with Soviet help felt stronger. But the Afghan people who were against the government did not stop fighting. They saw the Soviet soldiers as invaders. They believed they were fighting to protect their homes, their religion, and their country. The invasion did not bring peace. Instead, it turned small fights into a full-scale war. This war would change Afghanistan and the Soviet Union forever. It was a decision that had many unexpected results for everyone involved. The war was fought between two main sides. On one side was the powerful Soviet army. They had many soldiers, tanks, helicopters, and planes. They fought alongside the Afghan government's army. Their goal was to control the whole country. They wanted to make sure a communist government stayed in power in Afghanistan. They wanted to stop the groups that were fighting against them. The Soviet soldiers were well trained and had modern weapons. They thought they had a big advantage. They planned to win the war quickly by using their strong military power to crush any opposition. On the other side were the Afghan fighters. They were called the Mujahideen. This word means those who fight in a holy struggle. The Mujahideen were not one single army. They were many different groups of fighters from all over Afghanistan. They came from villages and towns. Their main goal was to push the Soviet army out of their country. They also wanted to remove the communist government. They believed they were fighting for their freedom and their religion. They did not have tanks or planes like the Soviets. They fought with older guns and used their knowledge of the land to their advantage. The fighting was very hard. The Soviet army could control the cities, but the Mujahideen controlled the countryside and the mountains. The mountains of Afghanistan are very high and difficult to travel through. The Mujahideen knew these mountains very well. They could hide there and attack the Soviet soldiers. They used surprise attacks and then disappeared back into the mountains. This made it very hard for the Soviet army to find and defeat them. The war was not a war of big battles. It was a war of small fights, ambushes, and traps happening all over the country. This kind of fighting made the war a stalemate. A stalemate is when neither side can win. The Soviet army was strong, but it could not defeat the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were good at fighting in the mountains, but they were not strong enough to push the Soviets out of the cities. For many years, the war continued like this. The Soviets sent more and more soldiers, but it did not change the situation. The war became a slow, painful, and very costly conflict. It was clear that this would not be the quick and easy victory that the Soviet Union had expected when they first invaded. The Mujahideen were not fighting alone. They received a lot of help from other countries. The United States was one of the biggest helpers. The United States and the Soviet Union were enemies in a global competition called the Cold War. The United States saw the war in Afghanistan as a chance to fight the Soviet Union indirectly. So, they sent money and weapons to the Mujahideen. This help was sent secretly through Afghanistan's neighbor, Pakistan. Other countries like Saudi Arabia and China also sent help. This support was very important for the Mujahideen. It allowed them to keep fighting against the powerful Soviet army for many years. The new weapons made a big difference in the war. At first, the Soviet helicopters and planes were a huge problem for the Mujahideen. They could attack from the air without much danger. But then, the United States sent a special weapon. It was a missile that could be fired from a soldier's shoulder. This missile was called the Stinger. It could shoot down helicopters and planes. When the Mujahideen got these missiles, the war changed. Soviet pilots were no longer safe in the air. They lost many helicopters. This new weapon helped to level the playing field and gave the Mujahideen a much better chance to fight back effectively. The war was terrible for the people of Afghanistan. The fighting destroyed villages, farms, and roads. Many people were killed. Millions of Afghans had to leave their homes to find safety. They became refugees. About 3 million people fled to Pakistan. More than 1 million fled to Iran. They lived in large camps, often in very difficult conditions. They had lost their homes, their jobs, and sometimes their families. Life for the people who stayed in Afghanistan was also very hard. There was constant danger from bombs and fighting. It was difficult to find food, clean water, or medicine. The Soviet army tried very hard to win. They used their planes to bomb villages in the countryside. They did this because they believed the villagers were helping the Mujahideen. Their goal was to make people afraid so they would stop supporting the fighters. But these tactics often made people angrier. It made more Afghans want to join the Mujahideen and fight against the Soviets. The war created a cycle of violence that hurt ordinary people the most. The country was being torn apart by the long and brutal conflict that seemed to have no end in sight. The suffering of the Afghan people was immense. After almost 10 years of fighting, the Soviet Union realized it could not win the war. The war was costing them too much. They were losing many soldiers. About 15,000 Soviet soldiers died in Afghanistan. Many more were hurt. The war was also very expensive. It was costing a lot of money that the Soviet Union needed for other things back home. The people in the Soviet Union were growing tired of the long war. They called it their bleeding wound. The Soviet leaders understood that staying in Afghanistan was a big mistake. They had failed to set up a strong and stable government that people would support. In 1988, the Soviet Union made a decision. They signed an agreement to take their soldiers out of Afghanistan. The United States and Pakistan also signed this agreement. The process of leaving began. Over the next year, Soviet tanks and soldiers started to move back across the border. On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldier left Afghanistan. For the Mujahideen, it was a great victory. They had fought a superpower and won. They had forced the Soviet army to leave their country. Many people around the world were surprised that the small groups of Afghan fighters had been able to do this. But the end of the Soviet war did not bring peace to Afghanistan. After the Soviets left, the communist government they had supported stayed in power for a few more years, but it was weak. The different Mujahideen groups started fighting against each other. They had been united against the Soviets, but now they fought for control of the country. This started a new terrible civil war. The different groups had different leaders and different goals. They fought over cities and land. The capital city, Kabul, was badly damaged by this new fighting. The hope for peace disappeared very quickly. From this chaos, a new group emerged. They were called the Taliban. They were religious students who promised to bring order and peace to the country. Many people were tired of war and supported them at first. The Taliban were very strict. They took control of most of Afghanistan by 1996. They brought an end to the civil war in many areas, but they also introduced very harsh rules, especially for women. The long war against the Soviets had left the country broken. This weakness allowed new and more extreme groups to take power, leading to more decades of conflict and hardship for the Afghan people.